Hello, and thank you for joining us for this Platt Institute webinar. I'm Adam Weinberg, joined by Jim Vocal, Chief Executive Officer here at the Platt Institute. We're just 1 week away from what was an extended tax filing and payment deadline, and there are many tax issues coming up in the 2020 Nebraska legislative session, which is set to continue later this month. I'd like to hand it over now to Jim Vocal, who will introduce our speaker today, who will field some of those issues for us. Jim?
Thanks, Adam. It's good to be with everybody, and it's good to have Senator Ann Linehan, who is the Revenue Committee Chair for the Nebraska Legislature, and who has been the leader who has championed property tax reform the last few years. And Senator Linehan, welcome to the Platt Institute webinar today.
Good morning, Jim. Thank you for having me.
We're going to dive right in. We've got session starting here in a couple weeks, as Adam said. You have been championing property tax reform since you've been in the legislature. I've had this job now for almost 8 years, and we have continuously seen property tax reform number one on most senators' lists to try to get something accomplished. I see it when I travel across the state and listen to constituents. Why is property tax reform so important to Nebraskans right now?
Well, I'd like to start here. I believe the tax burden on all Nebraskans are too high. We are a high tax state. And it's critical that Nebraska's tax structure is fair to large and small businesses, including agriculture, manufacturing, healthcare, insurance, banking, and transportation. And for Nebraska to be successful, all those industries which are the backbone of our economy, need to continue to thrive. Each are important. So I want to start here. I don't think the legislature should be pitting different industries against each other. I think our job is to figure out a way that we can help move them all forward. So yes, property taxes, I believe, are critically important. We're way too high in Nebraska. I think you have a couple of slides we can go to. Adam, if you pull the first slide.
Not a problem.
Thank you. So this is from the Tax Foundation, and it just explains, it kind of points to where Nebraska is. So if you take out the Northeast, where there's very little agriculture, you can see that we're a very high tax state. We're like 40th in the country from being a good place to be taxes. And if you look at the states right around us, Iowa isn't that far behind us, but Kansas, Missouri, Colorado, Wyoming, South Dakota, all their tax burden is significantly less than in Nebraska. And if you look, I can't see the other side here, but it says on the words, if you can read over here on the right-hand side, that Nebraska is on average $1,855 for a $100,000 house, whereas if you look at Missouri or Colorado, I think this is shocking, Colorado is $607. So if you're a retired person living in Nebraska, and you could just as easily live in Colorado, which also provides a significant income tax deduction for retirees, it's hard to argue that you should stay in Nebraska. It's a problem that affects homeowners, retirees, and agriculture. I live in Elkhorn, and in Elkhorn, where the levy is $2.40, taxes on a $100,000 home are $2,400. They're just extremely high compared to anywhere else in the country. And the other thing, I think people are more aware of it maybe in my district, in Elkhorn, Waterloo, and Valley, because they move here from other states and they're shocked by the property taxes.
Well, I'll take your slide and expand on it. I think that we are the 7th or 8th highest property tax rates in the country. And that landscape, obviously, as you pointed out, is not good for farmers, families, and Nebraska businesses to operate here. Adam, and correct me if I'm wrong, we've also had the 6th highest valuation increases in the country. Is that correct, Adam?
Yeah, if you look at a report from the Federal Reserve of Kansas City, housing prices in Nebraska have gone through a really rapid increase, more than almost any other state, as you mentioned. And so ultimately that is going to factor into the valuations that people see on their property tax bills. Senator Linehan, there's a question from an attendee. They asked, do Wyoming residents pay $1,635 on a $100,000 property or $635? Because their ranking doesn't make any sense if it's the latter. And I think there may be some factors in there with how Wyoming structures its tax system, but do you have any thoughts there?
I do not. When I've looked at other things, I think Wyoming's property taxes are not that insignificant. I mean, that could be wrong. This is from the Tax Foundation, but they have no income taxes, and South Dakota has no income taxes. So that just makes the point that we also have a rather high income tax rate on individuals, starting at 28,000. That's where our high bracket starts. So, and we have high property taxes. We're just a high tax state.
We certainly are, and I know you're trying to do something about that, and that's why when session comes back here in a couple weeks, we're going to hopefully be debating LB 1106. I'm going to ask you to walk us through that in a second, but walk our listeners through a little bit as the Revenue Committee was considering what bill to move forward. Were there any non-starters that the Revenue Committee had to take into account, such as expanding the sales tax base when you were leading the efforts to craft a property tax bill?
Yes, that was a non-starter. Last year, we spent a considerable amount of time trying to broaden the sales tax base. It ran into huge opposition, including from the governor. We did bring it to a vote. We stripped it out of 289 and put it in another bill, which was basically just broadening the sales tax. And I think we got 23 votes. And some of those votes were more sympathy votes and really believed in it votes. I don't think people want to the legislature wants to raise taxes with no corresponding insurance that other taxes will go down. So that is off the table.
Sure. So LB 1106, I assume, is going to be the vehicle that is going to be debated. I know that there's a committee of 10 people talking about a compromise package, but let's just, from a 30,000 foot view, walk us through what LB 1106 does, and then I'll have some follow-up questions for you.
Okay, from the 30,000 foot view, what we are doing is we are lowering valuations for schools, tax purposes, and simultaneously increasing state funding. So we are trying to leave the schools exactly where they are today, as far as their ability funding for their schools, but we're trying to increase the state aid. And one of the reasons our property taxes are so high is because Nebraska is very low on state funding for schools. Now, we spend I think a reasonable amount on education. I don't think we're a low spender. We're not a low spender, but we're low when it comes to state funding. If you look at the census data from the US government, we're like 48th or 47th in the country when it comes to state funding. So,
and when you mean state funding, that's the amount that's actually coming from the state. But when you look at it in totality with what's coming from a local standpoint, it's pretty significant per student, correct?
right. I think if you take a cost of living into consideration, I can't remember exactly, 12th or 13th in the country on what we spend per student. So we don't not spend significant amount on education, and Nebraskans have done that. They believe in education, public education. I understand that, but we are not, as a state, picking up, I believe, our fair share. So we need to take it off the taxpayers' back and put more of it on the state's property tax, off the property tax and put it more on the state tax rolls.
So the state funding goes to reduce the assessment ratio for education purposes, correct?
For only education, on both agriculture, commercial, and residential. So it's all Nebraskans.
And what does that do to the specific ratios over 3 years?
So the specific ratios, ag would go from 75 to 55, and commercial and residential would go from 100 to 87.
Okay.
So both significant decreases.
It's been reported in the news that the group is still looking for 33 votes for this. And obviously, as session comes into play, the incentive package is going to possibly be part of a total package. But as it stands now, as you look into the session, what are the main objections to your bill? And who are the stakeholders that are driving those objections?
Well, I think a lot of the objections are because people don't understand. I still get calls on the bill that was from last year or the bill that was introduced in January versus 1106. So I think a lot of it is just confusion. And then probably the other major thing is just change. People are resistant to change, even if I haven't talked to anybody I remember that ever told me they love the way things are. Everybody agrees property taxes are too high, but when you go to change things, it concerns people. So I think it's mostly just the fear of new. I think if people really understood how it would work, the vast majority of people would support it. And there's also, to be honest, we've got a system right now on state aid where some of our schools are getting 50 to 60% of their funding from the state, quite a few of them larger schools. But then you have other schools who are only getting 10% of their funding from the state. So there's a huge difference in the schools and how we treat, actually get right down to how we treat children in different school systems. And in the option funding, a child receives almost $10,000 from the state. Okay, that's one child. Another child who might be in a non-equalized school district in the western part of the state might receive $1,000 from the state. So I don't think that's a discrepancy that most Nebraskans would find fair. I think Nebraskans, I've always thought this, Nebraskans are very fair, and they don't want to have one child getting $1,000 from the state while another child gets $9,900. It makes no sense.
A follow-up question to a specific in your bill, and this is going to lead into a question that's in our queue right now. Are there spending lit provisions within LB 1106, and can you walk us through what those are? Meaning, are schools going to be constrained at all in future years from a spending standpoint?
So for the first 3 years, they're exactly the same spending constraints that they have now. So it's a $5 limit on their levy. That doesn't include bonding, that's just for general funding. So that does not change. That's the same, they have the same levy limit. In year 4, which is 23, it does say that your spending cannot go up more than 2% plus real growth from the prior year. Now that 2% is under consideration. We've talked about whether that should be 3%, whether it should be what the state spent last year. So we keep the state legislature doesn't expect more out of the schools than they're doing themselves. That's still under discussion. But right now that's 2.5%. So it wouldn't be, it's not that much different than what they're under right now.
When factoring in the cost of living, you had mentioned Nebraska schools are very well funded. What can be done? This is a question from the audience. What can be done to control spending at the local level? And for a conservative state, Nebraska sure seems to have a lot of government. Do you want to address those two questions, please?
Yes, we do have a lot of government, and that is something that I believe a group should come together and look for and see how in the future we might be able to get by with less government. We changed dramatically over the last 50 years where our people live and how we can provide services. So I think that needs to be studied and looked at. Maybe it's a project the University of Nebraska could help with. I do think there needs to be a group of leaders in Nebraska that look at that. In the short term, before we get to major overhaul of government, we just have to be more aware of spending. We have several people, several entities that can levy taxes, property taxes. I think on my statement, there's a dozen. We've got levy limits on many of those entities. What we've not done, and why we're in the place we're in today, you can have a levy limit, but if there's no limit on valuation increases, you're still gonna have runaway spending. And it's not because I think anybody's being wasteful. It's just a matter of matching what we can afford to what we want to have.
You had mentioned funding coming from the state under LB 1106. That's what's called foundation aid, correct? This is a question that's coming from our audience today. Can you explain what foundation aid is and how it is incorporated into LB 1106?
Yes, I can. But let me start here. TIOSA, as it is today in law, is basically equalization aid. Equalization aid is very important. If you don't have it, you will get taken to court. You will lose. The courts have decided for decades now that you cannot have school systems in the same state where one is severely underfunded and the kids down in West Omaha or east of Lincoln have a better chance of education because their property taxpayers can pay for it, while the kids, well, let's take Omaha. Omaha is highly equalized, and it needs to be because they don't have a property tax base to pay. So that has to come first, equalization aid, and that comes first still. But also, in addition to equalization aid, every student would receive a specific amount from the state. And I think in the year 3, it's $2,000 and some dollars. It depends on, it's tied directly to 15% of the state's net revenues. So it'd be 15% of the state's net revenues divided by the number of students. And we currently have and have had since 1960s what we call apportionment. So there is part of the school funding that now goes out based on the number of kids in the school districts as far as the census, not the number of children in that school, but the number of children in that school district census. So we have something like that now. This is just catching it up to the current times.
Before I get into how we move your LB 11064, what the path is, another question that relates to state spending, and it's a tough question, but it's an important one. We have 93 school districts, I believe, in the state of Nebraska.
294.
Let me double check this question. Oh, it said, should Nebraska have 93 school districts, meaning one per county? Is school consolidation an option on the table that you and your colleagues continuously take a look at?
There are, I believe, but this is just Ann Linehan, I'm not talking for any of my colleagues. There are some schools where merging seems appropriate. There's many reasons that's not happening. I'll use my hometown where I grew up, Lewiston Public Schools. They're a small school. They just graduated 7 seniors. There's pride there, I get that. There's also, a lot of times you'll find the school district next door that would be the best to merge into has a levy that's double what they're paying now. So you're not going to get schools to merge if it means doubling their property taxes. It's something I think 1106 would help us get closer. Levies would be closer and it would make more sense.
There has been a lot of discussion about tying the property tax bill with the incentive package LB 720. Is it your understanding, we heard from Speaker Scheer last week, that they will be considered as one package and one debate trying to build consensus moving forward?
Well, that is where I have been and the speaker has been for quite some time. We haven't convinced everybody else that that's a good idea. But I think that's the way you get it, any of it done. I don't think right now, and I've looked at vote cards and I've talked to a lot of senators, I don't think right now any one of the bills on their own, whether it be 1084, which is the next project, incentives, 720, or 1106 have 33 votes. I can't see how you get there. So I think in the end, I'm hopeful that we will find a way to put them together and have a package that helps all Nebraskans, helps ag, helps business, helps owners, and helps make sure that we keep the industries that we need in Nebraska. We need an incentive bill and we need property tax relief. I think we need both of them.
So that is the path forward. How do you handle, or how do you navigate that path forward with still either senators or outside groups, stakeholders that are continuously opposed to the bill?
Well, I think obviously we've been meeting 10 of us, but it's been difficult for us to get together with other senators as much as we will now when we get to Lincoln. I think when we have a chance to talk to each other and actually face getting nothing done like we did last year or getting something done for everyone, we'll choose getting something done for everyone.
Can you can you talk a little bit about any opposition coming from the schools? Has there been any progress since the end of session, or are they generally still opposed to 1106? And maybe walk us through why they may be and what needs to potentially happen to get them on board.
Well, I have not met with the schools since we left in March, but others have. And there's the great concern by the equalized school districts that there won't be enough money to do both. So that's their concern. And I'm not sure, quite frankly, with the smaller schools, what their concerns are. It is very frustrating. It's 1106 is complicated because you've got 244 school districts. They've all got different situations. Many of them have the levies range from 40 cents to almost $1.20. Going back to the question about should we have one school district in every county, Douglas County tried the learning community with Sarpy County. That was never popular. You've got 7 school districts in Douglas County, so I don't see Westside or Elkhorn or Bennington deciding they're going to be part of a different school district. That's very, I understand that. People love their schools. They move back to their home school districts for their children's. So I don't see us doing that. I think we've got a situation in greater Nebraska where you have one school district setting that's at $1.05 plus bonding. So let's say $1.15 setting next to a district at 40 cents. It's not, the current system is broken. Everybody knows it's broken. Nobody argues that it's a perfect system. So I just think it's fear and people not understanding that they understand what they have, and though they don't like it, they're afraid of new. I think that this bill is good for all students in all schools.
If the schools aren't on board, is there a plan B out there? An alternative to LB 1106 that this committee of 10 is looking at, or that you're looking at as an alternative if they are the main?
I haven't seen any alternative that the schools would change their minds on. I haven't. But I believe in public education. I think education is important. I moved my family when they were small from one school district to the next. I get that. It's critical, and it's the only hope for a child who's born into poverty or has a tough beginning is a good education. But education can't trump every other thing in the state. We have to have a strong business culture. We have to have a strong ag economy. If you let ag economy or the business culture, business fail, you're not going to have any money for any schools. We have to protect people's investments, people who are willing to invest to build a business, people who are willing to borrow money to plant the next farm crop. You have to protect the people who pay the bills. And that's what the legislature, I think, should be focused on. How do we make sure we provide for education, but not at the expense of people's livelihoods? That won't work.
I really appreciate that, Senator. I've got one bigger question about the landscape, and the questions are certainly mounting up in our Q&A section, and they're also getting texts to me on a regular basis as we speak. This crisis hit Nebraska. No one expected the pandemic. It's obviously had an effect on Nebraska's families and farmers and businesses, and it's had an effect on the state budget here in Nebraska. Tell us why you believe property tax reform is still important during this pandemic, given possible budget implications of the pandemic. And then the second question is, and you can read about it in today's op-ed in Omaha World Herald, which I wrote about, how does tax conformity with the CARES Act potentially affect the path forward with 1106? So two-part question, pandemic, budget concerns, and then second, conformity.
Well, we don't know for certain yet, but as I understand it from talking or reports I've seen from the Revenue Department, we are not going to come in that much farther below for last fiscal year of our certified budget. There won't be the excess funding to go into the rainy day fund. I think when we left Lincoln, we thought we were going to have money to pay for incentives, to pay for property tax relief. It was all in the budget, and on top of it, we had $275 million to go in the rainy day fund. Well, we did not collect the April income taxes that were due on April 15th. We're not going to collect them till July 15th. That is somewhere around $250 to $300 million. So that's why that money's gone. It's not gone, it's just moved to this fiscal year. So I don't think our fiscal picture is that bad. Now, why don't I think it's that bad? Because thankfully, Nebraska's banks, as soon as the CARES Act passed, went to work on Friday night instead of waiting till Monday morning. We're one of the best states. I don't know, your op-ed mentioned this morning, like 4th in the country for the number of Paycheck protection loans that went out. That's huge. It was what I think you said, $3.4 billion. We had the money that came in to each, almost anybody who made less than $75,000 got $1,200. And a family got $2,400 plus $500 for kids. And you've read, Senator Groney and Senator Friesen said in one of our meetings that you couldn't buy a riding lawnmower in North Platte or Grand Island. You couldn't buy above ground pool. So our revenues in April, whichever sales tax revenues, which everyone thought would be way off, we're not that far off. So we don't know, but I am not of the doom and gloom that we're not going to have any money. So I'm always hopeful. I'm an optimistic person, but right now the numbers look like we're going to have enough money to do these things. Now, the CARES Act tax cuts were new to us, right? So that's $125 million, I think, the first year that we right now do not have place for in the budget but we're not going to know that. So I think the best way forward, again, is trying to help everybody. And why is property tax, I mean, if it was important before the crisis, it's critically important now. I mean, how can you say that now that everybody has less money and we're in a financial downturn, that we shouldn't help every Nebraskan that pays a property tax bill? I just don't understand the thought process behind that.
If for some reason 1106 in its current form doesn't move forward, is there a fallback or consideration for putting more money into the property tax credit fund? And what is your opinion about the property tax credit fund as it relates to reform? Obviously, the Platte Institute has weighed in. We believe that it does nothing to actually lower the rates or impose limits. It's a shift from sales and income tax into a very modest program that doesn't necessarily do anything to lower rates and put those limits on. Is that a plan B that's out there, Senator?
It's not my plan B. I don't have a plan B, frankly. I mean, I do not like the property tax credit fund. It's there. I agree if we do away with it now, it appears as a tax increase. But to keep putting money in that is very bad policy. As you said, it doesn't do anything to slow down spending. So the Platte Institute testified to one of our Revenue Committee hearings, and if I remember the numbers right, we have put over $2 billion in the property tax credit fund since 2007, and property taxes have gone up well over that. So it's not working. I mean, that's the main reason I don't like it. It doesn't work. Property taxes, my taxes on my home go up faster than the property tax credit goes up. And that's going to continue to happen. The other thing, people who think that's a good idea don't understand generally, I have found how it works. Because it's helpful to some, very helpful, but others, it's not near as helpful. So it depends, it's paid back on your valuation, not on what you pay in taxes. So a person paying at a 50-cent levy gets as much back as a person paying at a $1.15 levy. It doesn't make any sense to me. It's not fair.
So to summarize, and then I'm going to go to some questions. Number one, you believe that even, especially during a pandemic, property tax reform is critically important? And number two, you believe that there's still a path forward, even with any possible budget considerations from the pandemic and conformity. Is that correct?
I do, because the way 1106 works is you can move levers and slow it down, put the implementation could go 4 years instead of 3 years. I think there's things we can do with other things. We need to, first of all, and that's why we're not going in until July 20, we need to know, we'll know on July 23rd or 24th, forecasting board says we have. So then we'll know what we have, and then we need to do as much as we can for as many as we can.
Is the governor on board with 1106 right now? That's a question coming at us from one of our participants who happens to be a colleague of yours on the revenue committee.
I always am very nervous speaking to where the governor is, but I feel confident that he would like to see 1106 come to a vote. So yes, the governor is supportive.
All right, I'm going to go to some specific questions about 1106 coming from our webinar participants today, and I thank everybody for joining us today. Senator Linehan, one component of LB 1106 is reducing the building fund for schools from 14 cents to 6 cents. Can you explain the rationale for this component, given that so many of our school buildings are aging and in constant need of repair and updating?
There is a concern that has been brought to us by taxpayers and senators that the building fund is supposed to be used for repairs, right? Air conditioning. It's not to build a new gym or a new grade school. And we have had some, the real rub here is you've had some districts who have had a bond issue fail and then go ahead and do the project with the building fund. So it's not just the building funds coming down, it's the consensus of the revenue committee. And I would assume most of the legislature that if you're going to build a new building and put your taxpayers millions of dollars in debt, there should be a vote of the people. And that's not happening right now. And it's, I know I've heard from school districts that say, well, we can't get a bond passed. Well, then if the people, they should have a right, the people, if you're going to put their property in debt. I mean, that's what a bond is. It's a debt on your property. And I think a vote of the people is necessary if you're going to put debt on people's property.
Thank you, Senator. Another question coming from one of your colleagues in the legislature, LB 158, currently in the Revenue Committee, would freeze valuations for 4 years. If we can't get LB 1106 passed, could this be a plan B?
That sounds wonderful. Freezing valuations. The schools, that would be very, very hard on the schools, because I don't know how you do that. The school formula now takes into consideration the valuations of your property. So what you would be doing is freezing, I think, I'm not a lawyer, but I think you would be freezing everything as it is today. And that doesn't help the 180 schools that aren't equalized. So I don't, and that would mean they weren't getting the equalization, even if their valuations really dropped. So I don't think that's a good plan. I'm willing to look at it, but I don't think we want to freeze ourselves into the situation we're currently in. I haven't talked to a lot of people who think they're happy about where we are.
All right, here's a big picture question, and one that we've been throwing around at the Platt Institute as well. The Nebraska Constitution assigns to the legislature the responsibility of providing free education to K through 12 students. Has your revenue committee explored taking away from the local school boards all of their taxing power and having the legislature provide 100%, meaning the state, the funding for each K through 12 school?
No, we haven't considered it. I think, first of all, let's start with this. I think total spending on K through 12 public schools in Nebraska is $4 billion a year. It's over $4 billion. That's their general fund spending. We don't have the state. I mean, that's how much money we have. We don't have that kind of money. I mean, we don't. We couldn't possibly do that. Now, is that something you could look? I don't think most Nebraskans are willing to give up their local controls of their schools. People move to school districts to be in that school district. I don't think they want the state to take it over.
We mentioned the property tax credit fund earlier, and I believe, Adam, correct me if I'm wrong, we're putting out about 2.5 a year in that fund.
270.
Right now, 275.
Okay,
275 million.
So if this is a temporary, or a lack of a better word, a piecemeal way of providing property tax relief, one of the questions from our participants today, and it's actually something that we have suggested in one of our major policy reports, Get Real About Property Taxes, why aren't we using this 2.75 towards more systemic property tax reform rather than the current form of the property tax credit fund?
Okay, so that's a good question. But here's the bigger question. We need, and Blueprint Nebraska had a report, I don't know, it came out earlier this year or late last year. We need to completely overhaul our tax structure in the state of Nebraska. We have too high property taxes, our income taxes are too high, our corporate taxes are too high. We need a complete overhaul. So, but I don't think if I'm a winner in the property tax credit situation, then I'm going to be willing to give that up for the promise of something else. We're going to have a plan that takes into consideration all our taxes before I think this governor or the next governor or the legislature would be willing to take that $275 million and do something else with it.
So nobody wants to take away what's already there now as a fallback, or the plan B, is what you're saying.
Right. I don't see that. That's why 1106 doesn't touch the current property tax credit fund. It's paid for by increased revenues on what we generate. The state's done a very good job. Chairman Stinner, appropriators, the governor, the legislature as a whole have done a very good job the last few years of keeping our expenses at 3%. So our growth in spending has been 3%. Our growth in revenues average 4.5%. So that extra growth in revenue over our spending is what we could use to pay for the incentive package, pay for the 1106. We had the money, it's built into our budget because we've been fiscally conservative over the last few years in Lincoln.
All right, another question. If you have foundation aid from the state, does that count towards resources in the TIOSA formula, resulting in less equalization aid in those districts getting significant TIOSA funding?
It would count as a resource, but they wouldn't get less TIOSA funding because equalization they still have to be equalized. As I said at the beginning, equalization has to come first. You have to make sure you're treating every kid in the state fairly.
And how do state mandates affect school spending? Another question from that same participant.
I've heard a lot about state mandates, but when you ask them specifically what they're talking about, they're not things that they shouldn't be doing. I mean, for one, I know one, and we have 2 years ago, we passed the K-3 reading bill. That is a state mandate, but we should be teaching kids to read by the 3rd grade. So I don't know how. I agree, it probably costs some money and it is a mandate, but in the long run, if a child is reading by 3rd grade, you're going to have a lot less problems down the road. It saves you money.
So much about this property tax debate is about engaging the public and being transparent with property taxes. You and Senator Ben Hansen have been working towards amending LB 103 by creating truth in taxation law in Nebraska. Can you tell us what that is? And do you have any thoughts about how it might work during this pandemic, where many Nebraskans may not want to attend a large in-person meeting?
A part of it's just, and I don't know, maybe this has always been the case, or maybe it's something new over the last couple of decades. I noticed that we had several taxing authorities saying the following: we didn't raise the levy. So that doesn't matter. If valuations go up, your property taxes are going up. So the whole idea that you can say didn't raise the levy and people here, at least what my constituents heard, was we didn't raise your taxes. So LB Senator Hansen's bill simply said, well, it says lots of things. I think it's a good bill, but it basically says if you're going to raise people's taxes, meaning your check that you write this year for pay your property taxes is larger than the check that you wrote last year. That's the tax increase. You need to notify them that you are doing so by mail, by postcard. So no more, you know, smoke and mirrors. We didn't raise the levy, so therefore your taxes aren't going up. We already have LB 103. They do have to now automatically your levies drop if your valuations go up. So they do have to vote to raise those levies. So we just need people to understand that just because your valuations go up does not mean your property taxes have to go up. But historically, at least for the last couple of decades, that's been what's going on in Nebraska.
Could technology such as Zoom, a Zoom platform, facilitate participation in public meetings, encouraging taxpayers to participate in this process more?
Well, I'm all for anything that will encourage more public participation in meetings. I am. I think another thing that Senator Hansen's bill has that I think is good is these meetings need to be held after, not 8 to 5. If you're working, how do you get to a meeting if it's 3 in the afternoon or 1 o'clock in the afternoon or 10 o'clock in the morning? If you want the public to participate, you've got to have it at a time where public can participate. I would even go to Saturday meetings. I mean, it's a foundation of who we are as democracy. And that means an informed and engaged citizenry. We have to allow citizens to engage, meaning you have to have it at a time that they can actually engage and know what's going on.
All right, Senator Linehan, I've got a 2 or 3 part complicated question from a participant. We'll take it one at a time.
Okay, thank you.
What is the annual value or expense of the 25% preferential valuation discount for ag land? Meaning, how much is this? What's the opportunity cost? Or what do we lose from a state?
Well, I'm not even, I don't know. But we tax agriculture at a higher rate. I did send you a slide, Adam. I don't think we've shown it. It's the ag one with the whole country.
Let's bring that up. I'll be just one moment here.
Okay, I'm sorry.
There we go. Can you see that okay?
I do. So if you look at the map on your right, you will see a sea of green once you get past the coast. All of those states, many of them are ag states. Look at the rate of they're paying compared to Nebraska's ag guys. So Colorado, 32, Nebraska, 94. We're the highest. I can't see it. Can you move the slide? I don't know how we can, because your picture on there, move it over toward more the middle.
Let's see. I think, Jim, if you can check for me, I think I see it in the full frame unless anything's in the way.
Here, I need to know how I'm doing. Yes, okay, I see it in the full frame. So you can see that even Illinois is at 31, Iowa 38, Missouri 28, Kansas 64, Colorado 32, Wyoming 28, South Dakota 35. Here we are, 94. There aren't that many states. Our ag guys are at a huge, our ag producers are a huge disadvantage to all the producers in the Midwest. Ag's very important to Nebraska. It may not seem so to everyone who lives in Nebraska, but ag, once you get west of Lincoln, it is ag. You get north of Omaha, it is ag. You go south of Omaha, it is ag. If ag fails, you have 170 schools who will need to be supported by the state. That's how important ag is. That's why you cannot burden ag to the point of breaking it or you will not have the funds to educate a huge number of kids in the state of Nebraska. Anyway, okay, that's the first question.
And the second question within this attendee's comments, when we discuss the discrepancy in the fairness of a local school student relative to school state aid, do we also consider the discrepancy in the fairness of the contributions of state tax payments from the school district?
Are they talking about the income tax rebate that's supposed to go? Originally, every school district was supposed to get 20% of their taxes back. Income taxes paid in would go back to the school. I think that's what they're suggesting. Yeah. Well, the problem with that is it's just as unfair as just letting schools use their property tax base and not having equalization aid, because your richer school districts and property are also your richer school districts. Not surprising, right? You're rich in property, you also happen to be rich in income. So you would have a situation where a very wealthy school district, I won't name any, well, Elkhorn, I'll just use Elkhorn. Elkhorn would have far more money than most of the school districts in the state of Nebraska, because we have high property value, and we also are, my legislative district, I believe, it's between me and 39 and 31, has the highest income in the state of Nebraska. So that won't work. It's not fair. I mean, that's why we don't do it anymore.
Have you heard in your time in the legislature the talk or discussion of a lawsuit to try to pressure the discussion on equalizing state aid as it relates to property taxes?
I've heard a lot that we can't do it because people will sue. I'm not sure how. I don't quite, I think when I've looked at it before, the Supreme Court, when somebody in Nebraska has sued over school funding, what the Supreme Court has said historically is that's up to the legislature. So that doesn't mean if something comes up that's obviously egregious, and that could, depending on between our option funding or differences in valuations, that somebody should, maybe could sue. But I don't think we're in a place now where that's likely.
All right, rolling through these questions here as we have another 12 minutes left of this great webinar. You and I, Platt Institute, agree that taxes need to be lowered across the board. I certainly have my ideas on how we can do that, and you do as well. The question coming from a participant, though, is what current services would need to be eliminated if we're going to lower taxes across the board?
I don't think we need to eliminate services. 1106 certainly doesn't eliminate any services. What we have to do is we have to get our public spending in line with our private ability to pay. So in 2009, Great Recession, almost every businessman that survived, businesswoman, every agricultural producer that has survived the 1980s, they had to get more efficient. They had to do more with less. People had to become more efficient. Our public sector needs to do some of those same things. They need to become more efficient. We can't have another economic crisis where the public sector doesn't slow down its spending while the private sector is trying to make sure they don't go broke. We just can't do, we just have to slow it down. Nobody has to cut anything. We just have to slow down the increases.
Is coming up with a new source of revenue an option, whether that's expanding the sales tax base to look at eliminating some of the exemptions? Is that an answer to tax reform?
Again, we tried that last year. We got 23 votes. It's all the same senators. I don't think anybody's going to change. In an election year, I don't think that's very likely.
It's the art of the possible, right?
Right. We're not going to increase taxes. And to be honest, which I hope I always am, so I wish I'd used a different phrase there. We don't need to raise taxes. We have the money to do this. There's revenue there. So we just need to understand that we're all going to be a little more, we're just going to adjust our increases to be not quite so much.
Okay, another question. This goes towards community engagement and transparency again. Public school officials often note that citizens don't routinely attend their budget hearings. It appears the information is crafted to keep citizens from fully understanding the numbers. How can this be changed, as financial transparency is critically important?
I don't think the school officials intentionally aren't transparent. I don't. I think it's very complicated, which makes it very difficult to understand. I mean, you've got school officials that don't understand TIOSA. We've got many people in the legislature that don't understand it. It's complicated, right? But I do think that we need a little more transparency on exactly what the schools receive from the state. It's not just TIOSA. TIOSA is a large part of the school aid formula. They also go to the Property Tax Credit Fund. The Property Tax Credit Fund is, I don't pay my what percentage, or you or any of us that get a credit on our property taxes, but the state makes that up so that 60% of that 275 million goes to the schools. Another thing, there's 100 million we now have in the Homestead Exemption. So 75 million of that 100 million goes to public schools. We have apportionment, which is some $55 million goes to the schools. There's a lot of state funding going to the schools currently, which I think a lot of people don't understand. It depends on what district you're in. If you're in Omaha, it's about 50% of your school's expenses are picked up by the state. If you're in Hastings, it's about, I think, 60%. If you're in Minutair, which I think is the highest, it's 80%. So we have a lot of school districts who are getting significant funding from the state. And then you have a whole bunch that are getting very little. That is a challenge for us. And I don't think a lot of people understand how much it would be, and my office is happy to provide anybody who wants it, how much of the funding for your school district is coming from the state. I think most Nebraskans would be quite surprised by the amount of funding the state sends to their school.
So you and I agree that Nebraska is woefully uncompetitive in a variety of taxes. Property taxes, 7th highest rates in the country. We've got the highest income tax rate from North Dakota to Texas. Highest corporate tax rate, I think, from California to Nebraska. Tangible personal property tax, the list goes on and on. I know we're in agreement, Senator Linehan, that we need comprehensive tax reform to our entire system. You had just stated that it doesn't look like expanding the sales tax base is going to be an option, certainly this year. What about next year as we look at some of the other high taxes, income tax, possibly property tax again? Will broadening the sales tax base be an option in 2021? And the second part of that question, what about a consumption tax? Where's the appetite in the legislature for that?
I think the consumption tax probably is so different that it will take a lot of education for people to agree that that's a good idea. So I don't think people know enough to have an opinion on the consumption tax. That's just I could be wrong. Our economy has changed significantly since the 60s. We now spend a lot more money on services and not so much on things. I think it's reasonable to question that if you go buy a lawnmower, you pay sales tax, but if somebody mows your lawn, you don't. It makes no sense to me. However, if we're going to broaden our base one place, we got to make sure we're actually doing something about the other high taxes. I think my 4 years, almost 4 years after we get done with the next 20 days down there I'm very concerned that people are willing to increase or broaden the base on sales taxes, but they're not willing to cut the other taxes. We've got to make sure that if we do anything to increase revenue, we're offsetting it with a decrease in other taxes.
Do you see that as a priority next year, budget year, for the Revenue Committee, for the governor, for the legislature as a whole to look at the systemic tax system? I'm going to be the guest this afternoon for the Nebraska Chambers webinar. We're going to be discussing that at 1:30.
Well, I'm certainly interested in that. And I believe, again, I don't want to talk for the governor, but nothing about anything he's done tells me he's not interested in lowering taxes. I think he would be very happy to lower taxes and get us in a better place than we are today.
Couple quick questions here as we wind down. How do states like Wyoming or Texas, which have lower property tax rates, fund their school systems? First question. And isn't one of the problems that we have in our state is that we lack the resources that they may have, like petroleum and minerals to tax?
That's true, but oddly enough, those are, well, I don't know so much about Texas because it's big, but Wyoming, I think, is going to be facing a lot of challenges with what's happened with the oil and gas prices, because they have been taking huge advantage of the fact they can buy things with other people's money. And it's going to be a tough road for Wyoming if things go the way they look like they're going. I think Nebraskans really, this pandemic has proved it. First time we can be happy we don't depend on tourism and we don't depend on oil and gas. So one of the reasons when you look across the nation and you see all these horrific numbers about what's going to happen to budgets, that a lot of that does not apply to Nebraska. We aren't, you know, I do have great empathy for the tourism industry we have, but it's not what drives us. What was helpful to us is so much of what we do is essential. Food processing, food production. No matter what pandemic, we had to have food, right? So that was there. Insurance, banking, another big parts of our economy. They are essential. So we're not in the tough spot that many of the other states are in, which I think we can be very thankful for.
Sure, and I want to circle back to something you said earlier, and this might be a good way to conclude if we don't have time for the rest of the questions. But you continue to stress that, okay, we're not expanding the sales tax base, but we do have the money to do property tax reform right now. We do have the money. Walk us through why you think that, especially during the pandemic and some budget constraints.
Okay, so we will not know until July when we get back, the forecasting board meets, about the future. But what I know about right now is the money, the $275 million that we thought was going to go in the rainy day fund has mostly disappeared. There might be a little bit, but mostly disappeared because we pushed back income tax collections until July 15th. But what was in the budget for property taxes for incentives is still in the budget. We're going to hit or come very, very close to the certified forecast. So I think with the will, if the will is there and if things don't change dramatically, I don't know what the forecasting board's going to do. But we were never using the surplus to pay for any of this. So that's why I think there's a lot of confusion, because from the very beginning, one think tank put out that we were using the surplus to pay for things, and as untrue as it was, and as many times as I have pushed back on it, that is still the chatter out there that somehow we needed the surplus to pay for 1106 or the incentive package or for the next project. The surplus was always by law going into the rainy day fund.
Final question, Senator, and then Adam and I will wrap things up. Is the property tax relief associated with the gambling petition the answer?
Is that supposed to be a simple question? I don't know what happens to the gambling petition. I mean, it's going to be, I see many more conservative people today. When I say conservative, they would like lower taxes. They're socially conservative, are ready to give in to gambling because they are so tired of the high taxes. I don't know what happens. I also know that we have a very strong personality in Nebraska by the name of Tom Osborne that hates the idea of gambling. So it'll be an interesting fall if that gets on the ballot.
Thank you, Senator, and thank you for your leadership on driving the property tax issue. We've enjoyed working with you and providing the testimony in the Revenue Committee, and hope to be a resource for you to find that path forward when you reconvene in a couple weeks. As I mentioned earlier, I'm going to be Brian Sloan's guest this afternoon for the Nebraska Chambers webinar, and you can hop on at 1:30 if you'd like to talk more about taxes and the need for overall reform and tax conformity. Adam, do you want to maybe talk about next week's webinar with Senator Stinner and our property tax town halls that we're starting on Monday?
Yes, Jim. Well, folks, you can join us again. Go to platteinstitute.org/events and join us next week, this same time, when we have Appropriations Committee Chairman Senator John Stinner, who will join us. We're also hosting a series of property tax town halls here on Zoom for regions across the state that you can participate in. This will be a voter and taxpayer-driven event where you can share your thoughts and ideas. I want to bring people together and talk about the possibilities for property tax reform going ahead into the future in Nebraska. So those are all at platteinstitute.org/events.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Senator
everyone.
Linehan. Thank you, folks, for joining us, and we'll see you next week.
Thanks.